The sea was calm that night. That was the detail survivors kept returning to, decades later, as if it mattered, as if a storm would have made any of it easier to accept. December 20th, 1987, 10:30 in the evening. The water of the Tablas Strait lying flat and black under a clear sky. And somewhere on that water, packed into a ferry built to carry 1,500 people, more than 4,000 souls were sleeping, sitting, standing, and dying without knowing it yet. Children lay folded above the water. Soldiers in uniform slept shoulder to shoulder with strangers in the corridors. A woman clutched a ticket that did not exist on any manifest, bought in secret from a crewman an hour before departure. A transaction that would erase her from official memory, even as it killed her. Then came the sound. Survivors would later struggle to describe it. Somewhere between a shriek of metal and a low, seismic groan, the sound of two vessels tearing into each other in the dark. The lights failed first. Then the screaming started. And then, impossibly, the ocean itself caught fire. To understand how a ferry became a floating crematorium, you have to understand the ship and the country that made it possible. The vessel had been born 24 years earlier in a Japanese shipyard as the Himeyori Maru, a modest passenger liner rated for 600 people. She passed through Philippine hands in 1975, was renamed, survived a fire in 1979 that should perhaps have been an omen, and emerged refurbished as the Doña Paz, flagship of the Sulpicio Line's fleet, running the punishing loop between Tacloban, Catbalogan, and Manila. In the Philippines, inter-island ferries were not simply transportation. For millions of Filipinos working far from home, they were the only affordable route back to family, and never more so than in the days before Christmas, when every ship in the archipelago filled far beyond what its paperwork claimed. The Doña Paz was licensed for 1,518 passengers and a crew of 60. On the night she sank, survivor testimony and later government estimates suggested she was carrying somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 people. More than double her legal limit, many of them never entered into any manifest. Tickets sold quietly, off the books, by crew members pocketing the difference. It was not an aberration. It was simply how the system worked, tolerated by an underfunded Coast Guard, ignored by a shipping company that had learned it could operate this way without consequence. Bridge discipline was said to be just as loose. Survivors and later investigators described a crew more interested in a movie playing on a small television than the darkened strait ahead. With only a single junior officer left minding the watch, moving toward that same stretch of water was a second vessel. One that should never have been allowed to leave port at all. The Mount Vector was a small, aging oil tanker, sailing from Bataan to Masbate with roughly 9,000 barrels of gasoline and petroleum products in her hold. Owned by a company operating without a valid license. Crewed by men who were, by every subsequent finding, unqualified to command a vessel carrying that much fuel through a busy shipping lane. Her rudder was faulty. She had no functioning lookout system worth the name. Two ships then, converging in the dark, one grotesquely overloaded with sleeping human beings, the other a barely seaworthy bomb of refined fuel, and between them, nothing but a few miles of empty black water closing fast. At approximately 10:30, near a headland called Dumali Point, the Doña Paz and the Vector collided. What happened in the next few minutes has never been fully reconstructed, because almost no one who could explain it survived. What is known is this: the impact ruptured the tanker's cargo, and the spilled fuel ignited almost immediately. Whether from a spark in the collision or the tanker's own systems, no investigation could ever say for certain. Flame raced across the surface of the water and up the side of both hulls at once. Passengers woke to find the corridors already full of smoke, the power dead. No crew giving orders, because most of the crew were already fighting for their own lives or already gone. Survivors later said the life jacket lockers were found locked. There had been no safety briefing, no drill, nothing to prepare 4,000 exhausted travelers for the moment. The only choice left to them was which way to die. Some chose the fire. Some chose the water, and found that the water itself was burning. A slick of gasoline turning the sea into a second inferno. So that jumping overboard did not mean escape, but simply a different kind of immolation. Those who found a clear patch of water swam through darkness thick with smoke, past floating debris, past people who could not swim, past bodies that had stopped moving, in a strait long known among local fishermen to be heavily populated with sharks. One survivor, a military officer traveling home with roughly 1,000 other uniformed personnel aboard that night, would later realize he was the only one of them who made it out alive, and could only guess at what the strait had done to the rest. The Doña Paz slipped beneath the surface within 2 hours of the collision. The Vector followed within 4. Both wrecks came to rest more than 500 meters down, taking with them nearly everyone who had been aboard. Help, when it came late. The first vessel to reach the survivors arrived roughly 90 minutes after the collision, by which point most of what could be found in the water was no longer alive to be rescued. It took a full 8 hours for Philippine maritime authorities even to learn that anything had happened, and roughly 8 more before an organized search and rescue effort was underway. A delay of nearly a full day imposed on a catastrophe that had run its course in under 4 hours. In the end, 26 people were pulled from the Tabla Strait alive, 24 passengers from the Doña Paz, out of a ship that may have carried more than 4,000, and 2 crewmen from the Vector's crew of 13, both of whom happened to be off duty and below deck at the moment of impact. Every officer on the Doña Paz's bridge died. In the days that followed, bodies washed ashore on the coast of nearby Mindoro in numbers the local villagers were never equipped to handle, and grave digging became for a time a grim daily routine for an island that had nothing to do with the disaster except its proximity to where the current carried the dead. No one has ever agreed on an exact death toll, because no one ever agreed on how many people were on the ship in the first place. The official passenger manifest listed under 1,600 names. A government investigation conducted more than a decade later put the true number of dead at approximately 4,385, a figure built not from a passenger list, but from grieving families reporting relatives who had boarded and never returned. By that count, more than 4 times as many people died on the Doña Paz as died on the Titanic, in a fraction of the time, with almost none of the world's attention. It remains to this day the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in recorded history, and one of the least remembered. The legal reckoning dragged on for decades. Investigators and courts ultimately placed primary blame on the Vector's owners and crew, citing the tanker's lack of proper licensing, its unqualified officers, and its unseaworthy condition. Sulpicio Lines, for its part, spent years publicly insisting the Doña Paz had not been overloaded at all, refusing to acknowledge any passenger not listed on its own incomplete manifest, even as families produced tickets, photographs, and testimony proving otherwise. The company's culture of negligence did not end with the disaster. Less than a year later, in October 1988, a sister ship in the same fleet, the Doña Marilyn, was allowed to sail directly into a typhoon and capsized, killing around 150 more people. A second tragedy that suggested the lessons of the Tabla Strait had been learned by almost no one who had the power to act on them. It was not until December of 2019, 32 years after the sinking, that a research vessel finally located both wrecks resting upright on the seabed. More than 500 meters down, a quiet, undramatic discovery that closed one of the few remaining open questions about a disaster whose larger questions, about greed, corruption, and a system that let it happen, were never really closed at all. What makes the Doña Paz disaster so difficult to sit with is not simply the scale of it, though the scale alone is staggering. It is the ordinariness of every failure that caused it. No storm, no act of terrorism, no single villain to blame. Just a shipping company that sold too many tickets because it always had, a tanker that should never have left port, a government too underfunded or too indifferent to enforce its own rules, and thousands of people who did nothing wrong except trust that the systems meant to protect them actually would. They were going home for Christmas. That is the whole of it. In the space of a few hours, an ordinary voyage on an ordinary stretch of water became the worst peacetime disaster the sea has ever produced. Not because of any singular act of malice, but because of how easily human institutions, left unwatched,